lot of the destructive nature of communism resides in this idea that you can completely cut a people off from their historical and cultural past, create a nation that is based on abstract ideas. Any state that believes in the iron laws of history is going to be a destructive state.
Welcome to Bay Area Innovators. Today we are continuing with part 2 of our interview with Dr. Robert Harrison, the Rosina Pierotti Professor of Italian Literature at Stanford University. Last week we talked about his book Juvenescence. Today we'll continue to analyze his book.
To the people of America, you relied on the Constitution. You relied on the Supreme Court. Excellent law for the lambs. But what if unhappily the judges were chosen from the wolves and give to the laws a wolfish interpretation?
And talk about his podcast entitled Opinions, the Narcotics of Intelligent Conversations.
And I call it the narcotic of intelligent conversation because if you do develop a taste for it, it becomes intoxicating. People who are hooked on it can't do without. In fact, whenever I go on hiatus for more than a few months, we get a number of emails saying, when are you going to be back on air? I'm having withdrawal symptoms.
This is Bay Area Innovators, and I'm your host, Steve Espas. Professor Harrison, welcome back to our program.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Yeah, well, we had a great conversation last week. I want to continue with the chapter 3 of your book, Juvenescence, in which you bring 4 test cases of what you call neotenic revolutions, right? So we have the Socratic philosophy, then we have the triumph of Christianity, the age of Enlightenment, and then the American Republic, pretty much. Please tell us about these 4 test cases that you are talking about.
Yeah, so they're called neotenic revolutions, and neoteny is a concept that comes from biology. It's about the retention of youthful characteristics in later stages of development, usually anatomical cases. I don't want to go into the biology of it, it's a little bit complicated, but I tried to do a history of cultural neoteny, the way in which youth manages to attain greater levels of maturity in the cultural sphere. And I give these 4 case studies about the rise of Socratic Platonic philosophy. We talked about that in our previous conversation. The triumph of Christianity, which is based on a theology of the child. As Matthew says, if you do not become as little children, you will never enter the kingdom of God. And the Enlightenment is strangely related to the child. Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, wrote a famous essay called What is Enlightenment? And it begins with the sentence, Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. So he speaks about enlightenment as a process of maturation, but always from the point of view of the child who is learning to reason and think for himself, herself, and how a people or a nation as a whole arrives at enlightenment through the practice of critical thinking and free thinking. America is often called the child of enlightenment because the founders and the authors of the American Constitution were very much steeped in Enlightenment ideology. And for me, the founding of the American Republic is an exemplary case of a neotenic revolution insofar as it incorporated all sorts of older legacies into its concept of a new nation that had never really existed before in history. They brought into their concept of America the wisdom of the Greek democracy, the Roman Republic, even the Carthaginian mercantile republic. They brought into it Christianity, this idea that God is not thrown out. There's a separation of church and state in the American Constitution, but the separation of church and state, they were well aware, has a Christian origin. When Christ is confronted by Pontius Pilate, he says, "Do you accept the authority of Caesar?" And he says, render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God. So there you have this idea of a separation of church and state. So that's another legacy, the Christian legacy, that is incorporated into the American idea, and various other ones. This Constitution is based also on the Declaration of Independence, where you have the famous lines that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And so this idea of we hold these truths to be self-evident, it's interesting. The first version said we hold these truths to be sacred. Mm-hmm. It was changed by Benjamin Franklin to say self-evident because it's much more enlightenment. No, it's obvious to what? To whom are these truths self-evident? They're not self-evident if you look at history. History has never known nations that were governed by the principle of consent of the governed, or devoted to liberty or to the pursuit of happiness. It is evident to the eye of reason. From the point of view of reason, this is evident, but reason is neotenic. It's a very new foundation on which to build a nation. Very few nations were founded on the idea of reason before the French Revolution. So the American Constitution was conceived of in this Enlightenment framework of a system that made sense and had a certain rationality about it.
And then the next point you're making, which I think is very important, is that the Constitution itself, even though it's a great document, probably as good as there is worldwide for a government to be governed by, but by itself, it doesn't really mean anything if the people's hearts are not in it. And also how you interpret the Constitution. And then you give the example how Abraham Lincoln interpreted the Constitution as plunging the country into civil war to save the country.
Right.
Then to prove that a country born on freedom is able to sustain itself
right.
through crises.
Yes, I mean, Lincoln undertakes a very important move in especially his Gettysburg Address, his famous address in the middle of the Civil War when it was not clear whether the Union was going to survive or not. And he says, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, that is not in the Constitution. It is in the Declaration of Independence. But this idea, and then he says that, and now we are here on this ground of the dead to determine whether such a nation can long endure, and that it will all depend on our dedication to the cause. And therefore, what is a constitution? Literally speaking, it's a bunch of words on paper. It only achieves the purchase that it has if the nation, the people of the nation, dedicate themselves and rededicate themselves time and again to the very principles of the Constitution. And I think Lincoln understood that the Civil War was a war between two sides, one of which was unconditionally devoted to the principles of the Declaration of Independence and to that Constitution. The other side was not the side of the Union. And he emphasizes the degree to which a country, this new nation of America, can only exist and endure to the degree that its citizens, the American citizens, commit themselves and recommit themselves time and again, especially in moments of crisis, to the founding principles of the Constitution. So he, in a true sense, came to the rescue of the Union in that moment of crisis. You know, the best answer to that question that you pose about it's in the heart of the people comes from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who in his 1854 lecture on the fugitive slave law, this was a law that obliged people from the North to send back the slaves who had escaped to the northern states. He writes the following to the people of America: "You relied on the Constitution. It has not the word slave in it, and very good argument has been shown that it would not warrant the crimes that are done under it. You relied on the Supreme Court. The law was right, excellent law for the lambs, but what if unhappily the judges were chosen from the wolves, and give to the laws a wolfish interpretation? These things show that no forms, neither constitutions, nor laws, nor covenants, nor churches, nor Bibles, are of any use in themselves. The devil nestles comfortably into them all. There is no help but in the head and heart and hamstrings of a man. Covenants are of no use without honest men to keep them, laws of none but with loyal citizens to obey them. To interpret Christ, it needs Christ in the heart."
I think that's an excellent point, and I want to give you a quick example, something that I experienced that has to do with the heart of the people. I remember going to Los Altos downtown area. I'm not sure if they still have it, but there used to be a market, and at night the people would leave all the fruit, all the vegetables outside. They may put a tarp around it, not even on top of it, right? And there would be no problem. The next day it's still there and people sell it, right? And then that took me back to Romania, where I grew up in the 80s. And one thing I remembered was that if you're biking, or if you're lucky to have a car, but if not, if you're biking at night, there's no lights, right? Because economy is bad. But you have to be very careful, because there were groups of people who were stealing the manhole covers, because they would melt it and make money out of it, right? So you have to be very careful how you drive or bike, so you don't drive into a manhole that's open, right? So I was comparing the hearts of the people on these two sides, right? And you realize that such a good point. If the heart of the people is not there, it doesn't matter. Anything else doesn't matter. And of course, the communist system doesn't really enhance the heart of the people good enough. But any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think the heart of the people is the same heart all around the world. And I think the good heart versus the bad heart, it depends on the institutional structures within which a society finds itself. The American founders were very skeptical and had a rather pessimistic notion of human nature in general. They thought there was a certain wretchedness and depravity, a tendency towards vice and sin, and therefore they tried to conceive of a system that would turn what could destroy a society into productive activity. So checks and balances. First thing, you don't allow power to centralize itself in either branch of government. So the House of Representatives checks the Senate checks the President checks the thing. So this idea that if power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yes.
And I think that with a successful nation that was founded on these principles, that it enables the heart of people in Los Altos. Of course, they privileged with it's a wealthy community and so forth. It enables the heart to ennoble itself. I think those same people under different conditions would be just like the Romanians that you're describing. In Romania, it's not that the heart is it's not intrinsically better in some people than others, but it's all a question of what kind of institutional foundation you have to promote the common good and to develop a sense of a commitment to the common good.
Let's move on to chapter 4 in your book, Amor Mundi. And I wonder if the destructive tendency that you talk about in there, if that's related to communism, if you see communism as an avenue for the destructive elements that happen in society.
Yeah, so you mentioned, in Romania, especially under communism, I wrote another book called Gardens, Reflections on the Human Condition.
And actually, that's a segue. I want to show it right here. We won't get into it today, but
no,
if you want to mention something.
So it's gardens not only in the literal sense, but also what is the activity of gardening and caretaking, when the gardener is a caretaker of the plot of land. But it also has served, as a figure for governments. And I mention in that book that there's two kinds of concepts of state. One in which the citizens are the caretakers and cultivators of the state. The other is a kind of totalitarian, communistic idea that the state is the caretaker of the citizens. And I think that where you have a government or a state which presumes to be the caretaker of the citizens, you do not encourage the citizens to develop that heart that is committed to the public good. Yeah. It's where citizens believe that they are the gardeners and cultivators and caretakers of the state, that's where I think you have a different ethic that takes over. Let's say it's the communist state or some other kind of fascist state in which the state presumes to be the caretakers of the citizens. This creates a certain cynicism in the people, a certain indifference, a lack of responsibility, and I think that it explains a difference in the heart of people in one system and the heart of people in another system. And I do believe that that communism in theory and also in practice is not based on an ethic of care and of help, but that it is highly driven by ideological dogma that does not engage the citizen in the productive way. And it also relies on the assumption that everything that preceded the communist state belongs to a past that was dominated by oppression, prejudice, superstition, and ignorance. And therefore, it declares war on the past. And it has as one of its principal missions to consign the past to oblivion. Therefore, it's huge rupture. And that's where I think a lot of the destructive nature of communism resides, in this idea that you can completely cut a people off from their historical and cultural past and create a nation that is based on abstract ideas. Like any state that believes in the iron laws of history is going to be a destructive state, in my view, because it's so assured of the righteousness of its cause that it feels justified to use any means necessary to achieve its own ends. Many atrocities and crimes have been committed by this conviction of being on the right side of history. I don't believe in the right or wrong side of history. Those who do believe in the right side of history, watch out, I think.
In the epilogue of your book, Juvenescence, you talk about this concept of Americanization. And I want to ask you about that. I think you gave a fantastic depiction of what that means. And you talk about a cube that is the United States or is America. And then the reflection of this cube that ends up being a square. If you project a cube on a wall, all you see is a square. It's a two-dimensional element, right? And other countries, or this Americanization exists as a square in other countries instead of the actual cube. And I want you to talk about it, but I feel that the mere conversation we're having today is more of the cube.
Yes.
Versus the square that other countries perceive of America. Right. Your thoughts?
Right. Well, I'm glad you say that, because it's. I'm very committed to the cube over the square, because the cube has 3 dimensions, the square has 2 dimensions, and so much of our reality today is determined by the screen. It could be the movie screen, the television screen, the computer screen, or the cell phone screen, namely a two-dimensional world where everything has lost a third dimension. So I hope our conversation has been more three-dimensional than two-dimensional. And yes, so Americanization, I think, is a world event. Even America's worst enemies, it could be the terrorists and things like that. You can find them wearing American blue jeans and American sneakers and using American cell phones, and the whole phenomenon of Americanization, I think, has become a global phenomenon.
Maybe tell our audience more exactly what you mean by that. So it's not just the McDonald's or the Walmart or the cell phones, right? It's a whole culture that somehow gets represented overseas, right?
Right. So this idea of the cube and the squares is projective geometry, and it's this idea that America, it's not the three-dimensional America that is being exported abroad. It's a very reduced version of America, which is the McDonald's and the mentalities, the youthful. And I think part of the appeal, universal appeal of Americanism has to do with the essential youthfulness of this American culture, post-war American culture. Not only youthful, I think it's more almost even infantilized part of the American thing. And therefore, when it's exported abroad, it's not the virtues of America that get exported. Oftentimes, it's the vices. It's so much easier to export a vice than a virtue. And I'm not saying that Americanization is necessarily only an element of vice. I'm saying that it's very interesting how it's a universal conquering of the rest of the world through a phenomenon of youthfulness that we've never seen before in history. And I think it has to do with the fact that our human species has a substrate, a neotenic substrate, that favors all forms of youthfulness, and there's something ultimately oppressive about excessive authority and maturity and the dowdiness and the gray, and there is an intrinsic appeal to the kind of liberation that Americanism represents. And yet, if you export only the youthful side of America, it's not going to have much of a future, because America is this almost miraculous amalgamation of a youthfulness combined with a certain kind of wisdom of maturity. And that's why it was a successful neotenic revolution, by which, as I defined it, youthful characteristics achieve new levels of maturity. So it's the difference between rejuvenation and juvenilization. Too much of Americanization is juvenilization, I think.
Speaking of that, I agree with you, but why do you think it's easier to export the bad elements versus the virtues in anything that you do, pretty much? Why do those bad elements catch on fire much easier? Maybe it's a $1 million question, but I would still like to hear what you think.
Well, virtue is always difficult. It's also the difference between building and destroying.
Yes.
It's much easier to destroy something than to build something. Yes. This is the terrible logic of bombs. You can destroy overnight something that takes centuries and centuries to build. When it comes to vice and virtue, it's also true in almost the vast majority of relationships. The vice of one of the partners will end up getting the better of the virtue of the other, rather than the other way around. And this is rather pessimistic, but unfortunately, if you have a virtuous husband and a wife who has vice, or vice versa, it's oftentimes it's easier to pull someone down than to pull someone up. So I'm very sorry to realize time and again that America's virtues are so difficult to export to the rest of the world.
how much of the vices of American culture that are being portrayed have to do with Hollywood or TV? Is it majority of it, do you think, or part of it?
I think Hollywood is a mixed blessing. There's some things that Hollywood has exported which have served the common good. I mean the global common good, I'm saying, because many of its stories are about the good versus the bad, and Hollywood has served as a moral education for people all around the world in a certain way.
But it almost became the standard.
Yes.
Yeah.
Then it becomes this kind of, again, theater of geometric projection where everything is a two-dimensional reality rather than the thing itself. I think that Hollywood has a role to play, but consumerism, I think, is even more important. American consumerism is also something that America has an interest to export because it profits. It
Yes.
creates markets of desire. So Hollywood, television, these things are part of the engendering of desires where there where no such desires existed before. So when you see all of a sudden that there's Twinkies or there's Mickey Mouse or there's things that you can have, I mean, the rest of the world through television or advertising or something, all of a sudden they compare themselves to a society that looks in the two-dimensional form like a Garden of Eden, that everyone is living in a state of complete bliss and beatitude, of material well-being, and therefore this encouragement that all of our happiness and self-satisfaction comes from consumption, I think is very dangerous as an export abroad, because it furthers the idea that we are consumers rather than citizens. There's a difference between being a citizen and being a consumer, but oftentimes American consumerism blurs that distinction entirely, and the election is always they're marketing to the voters as consumers of particular values, and how much your economics and your pocketbook, and candidates are always appealing to this material substrate of material consumerist well-being, rather than appealing to the dignity and honor and mature responsibility of the citizen. I mean, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? If this is the only absolute standard of how you elect a president or choose a party, I mean, it's a very sorry situation, because economic well-being, if you're 5% better or 5% worse or 10% better, that cannot be the sole standard in a republic as was conceived by the founders of the American nation. There has to be more to the idea of citizenship than how well off you are in your pocketbook. There has to be, otherwise this form of government cannot survive.
I'd like to change gears and talk about your podcast.
Yes.
So you'll be having a podcast at Stanford's KZSU radio for 20 years now?
Yeah, it's going to be 20 years in 2025. Yeah.
One of the longest podcasts ever. It's called Entitled Opinions, and the nickname is A Narcotic to Intelligent Conversations, and I can already sense how that would happen. Please tell us about it, and I would love to learn more. I think our audience would like to check it out.
Yeah, so this podcast, Entitled Opinions, began before there was even a word for podcasts. I think the word podcast came into existence afterwards. I started at almost the same time that iTunes became a reality, and therefore we were able to post our shows on this completely new medium, which was iTunes. I'm the host, and I have guests, many of them, probably most of them from Stanford, professors, and it's called Entitled Opinions. I'm punning on the word title because they PhD, not all my guests have PhDs, but nevertheless it's this idea that it's...
they are entitled to their
yeah,
opinion.
they are entitled to their opinions one way or another, right? And the show is a combination, there are many literary shows, philosophy, music, science, as much as I can, and cultural history. So it's a 1 hour show with a one-on-one conversation between me and the guests, and we try to go in depth. We try to be as cube-like as possible in our treatment of topics, and to do justice to the complexity and the depth of the topics. So it's not for everyone. I call it the narcotic of intelligent conversation, because if you do develop a taste for it, it becomes intoxicating, an intellectual intoxication that people who are hooked on it can't do without. In fact, whenever I go on hiatus for more than a few months, we get a number of emails saying, "When are you going to be back on air? I'm having withdrawal symptoms from entitled opinions." So
that's fantastic. I mean, that is awesome. And it's always hard to sleep at night when you get very excited about the topics, but that's okay. That's a good thing. Right?
Yeah.
Tell us some of the guests you brought in, if anyone that stood out, or any stories that you have about it.
Well, I've had a whole array of guests from, I've even had on a few occasions undergraduates who I thought were extremely The one consideration I have when it comes to choosing guests is it going to be worth it for my listener to spend an hour of his or her life listening to this conversation? And if I feel that an undergraduate can meet that criterion, I don't mind having. But I go from there to Nobel Prize laureates, like Orhan Pamuk came to Stanford, and I interviewed Orhan Pamuk. I had famous philosophers like Richard Rorty, the American philosopher now deceased, René Girard, the French theorist. Marilyn Robinson is the Pulitzer Prize-winning, novelist, and a number of other kind of more high-profile guests. But most of them are just people who know really well what they're talking about, either because they've authored books on the topic or they've been teaching it for a number of years. I think what's special about the podcast is that it's a true conversation insofar as we begin and then it meanders and it takes the form of probing. And so it's at once informative, educational, but it's also reflective, and it covers a broad range of different issues. So far, so good. I mean, the audience has been growing steadily. A number of things. The invention of the iPod did wonders for business. Now all of a sudden people were able to listen in gyms and on airplanes and things of that sort. COVID, there was a huge increase in the listening of podcasts in general during the COVID years. Yeah. And therefore I think the audience, for all podcasts, but especially entitled opinions, was much greater after COVID. I mean, or during and after COVID than before, because a lot more people are listening to podcasts these days. At the same time, every third person now has a podcast, so the whole medium is filled with noise. Yeah. The average podcast in America has 7 subscribers. Well, we have like 15, 20,000, so it's
how does one see it? We'll put the website on the screen.
Well, there's two
or watch it. I mean, listen to it.
So it's on all the podcast platforms. It's on Apple, Spotify, Google, iPod. We also have a website, which is the easiest way to listen to it. It's a website for entitled opinions where you just press play, you don't have to download. But most people access us through iTunes, what used to be called iTunes, which is now Apple Podcasts. And there's over 300 shows in the archives. You can go back all the way to some of the earliest conversations in the first year, where I had many of these people like Richard Rorty, René Girard, and others. And then you can also choose your topic, not just the guest. If you're interested in Albert Camus, or if you're interested in Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, or Shakespeare, Dante, these topics, the archive is full of possibilities.
Professor Harrison, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate
It's been
you
a
being
pleasure,
here.
Steve.
Any concluding thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, no, I'm just grateful that we had the occasion to exchange some ideas around issues that I think are very important, and I'm grateful that you made a heroic effort with Juvenescence, and I think that you've grasped the real core of that book as something that I'm grateful to, because it's not an easy book, as you mentioned. You don't know what you're getting at the beginning, but
well, I have to say thank you, because I learned a lot from the writing style and the stories and the depth. I think the most important thing is the depth of the ideas. And you mentioned all these philosophers and historians and literature. It gets to a depth that you don't easily, you have to read so many books,
Yeah.
right, to get to it. So
depth is, you could say, is my virtue and my fault at the same time, because if I always insisting on depth, sometimes it's asking too much of the reader or the interlocutor. But that's who I am. So
Absolutely.
I appreciate that you appreciate the depth.
thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Steve. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching another episode of Bay Area Innovators. If you enjoyed this episode and you know someone who should be on our show, please send us an email at sfbay@epochtimes.com. We would love to hear from you. Thank you, and see you next week.